All right, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us again at this wonderful symposium. It's my pleasure to introduce the next group of panelists on speculating and acting. Our first guest, Silvia Benedito, will be sharing her insights on cold fire landscape management for warmer climates. Silvia is a registered architect, urban designer, and associate professor of landscape architecture here at the GSD. She focuses on the quality of the built environment and its capacity to foster communal well-being and ecological resilience. She is also the co-principal of Officina, the multidisciplinary practice based in Cambridge and Germany. Our next speaker will be Amy Whitesides. Amy is a registered landscape architect, practitioner, and educator. She is a design critic in landscape architecture at the GSD and is currently researching agroforestry through Salada's Institute here at Harvard. As the former director of resilience at Stoss, Amy ran many of the firm's waterfront efforts and Boston's urban forest plan, which she'll be sharing with us this afternoon. And our final speaker, Eric Kramer, is a landscape architect and principal at Reed Hildebrand. Through his work, Eric brings equal attention to research, engagement of people and communities, and the potential of design. He has led projects associated with the renewal and enrichment of campuses, cities, and institutions, including Cambridge Urban Forest Master Plan, of which he will focus on sharing with us today. So I think history has told us that it takes all kinds to shift a trajectory, ones that challenge us to see in a different light, and those with the care and determination to see those visions through by acting. I believe this group today will cover this spectrum, and we look forward to your presentations and the discussion afterwards. So Silvia, please take the stage. Thank you.
Hi, hello everyone. I know it's difficult having lunch and then coming here, so I'll try to keep your flame burning. Silly joke, I know. All right, so every minute, wildfires rage worldwide, now surpassing historical records in both scope and intensity. The IPCC report claims with very high confidence that this fire reality will increase in a warmer future with drier soils and longer growing seasons. Additionally, evidences link this widespread disturbances with long-standing procedures, including one, top-down fire policies, and two, the eradication of fire from landscapes at any cost, overlooking its ecological role and its cultural significance among traditional and native communities and First Nation peoples. Last summer, we witnessed devastating wildfires in Maui, Hawaii, and the last weeks in Valparaiso region in Chile. In 2023, Canada was scorched by a record-breaking fire season, consuming more than 18 million hectares of land, approximately the size of North Dakota. This seems to be the story in most flammable landscapes on Earth, writes David Bauman. The removal of traditional landscape management by colonization and globalization has combined with climate change to turn these landscapes into tinder boxes, end of quote. These conflagrations remind us of the paradoxical reality that we are creatures living with, within, and under the forces of water, air, soil, and fire, engineering and designing with this, but also altering our long-standing entanglement with the natural elements. The use of fire and allied substances, charcoal, smoke, ash, heat, and light is one of the most radical, ancient, and widespread forms of energy and technique for creating and maintaining landscapes. And recent findings in cognitive intelligence also suggest that fire played a crucial role in helping early humans regulate attention. As the authors write, and I quote, "The most enduring tool that fire ever made might just be the human mind," end of quote. So despite the undeniable bound to human's history, fire has become one of the most politically charged and contested elements in today's ecological urgency. This has been fueled by an ethical awakening in the core of ongoing systematic inequalities, linking the history of fire suppression with cultural marginalization and the colonial dispossession of traditional communities, practitioners of low-burning techniques such as cold fire to assist pastoral and agricultural production, spiritual well-being, cultural practices, biodiversity stewardship, or simply to protect their villages against wildfire threats. So what does all of this relate to design? Vitruvius describes in his treatise, the Architectura, the fire in a clearing as the first shelter, where language evolved to collectively maintain the benefits of this fire for protection, warmth, cooking, and reverie. Vitruvius adds that the necessary coordination and protocols to maintain such benefits led to the idea of the polis. So 2039 years, more precisely, after this initial definition of a shelter, what does it mean today to live around and with fire? And where is now the fire in the clearing? Much of today's territory subject to wildfires occur in rural areas or low-density territories, urban wildland interfaces, the countryside. A territory 50% bigger than our cities combined, writes Kulas in his countryside report. Here he points out that these areas are the ignored realm, largely off our radar, as the design profession has mostly been concentrated in urban challenges. Despite ignored, he adds, these territories hold evidences of progress in multiple domains. In this vein, I would like to share with you today additional evidences of progress regarding wildfire resilience, landscape stewardship, and cultural restitution in the rural lands, driven by a paradigm shift grounded in two core beliefs. One, that wildfires are not intensified only by climate change, but mostly fueled by cultural policy and land use changes. So, that cold fire, point number two, is essential in fostering resilient landscapes and communities through new bottom-up reciprocities, harnessing both ancient and contemporary knowledge. So here a few examples to share with some backup data. So a new congressional report from 2023 published that wildfires are costing the US economy between 400 and 800 billion annually. The paradoxical reality of wildfire expansion, despite increasing federal investments, has prompted an urgent need to explore new approaches rooted in shared stewardships, involving partnerships with traditional communities and their fire ecological knowledge, academia, NGOs, landscape architects and state agencies. For instance, the Pueblo of Tesuque, a native community at the foreground of cold fire knowledge, has been granted authority under the Treaty Rights Land Program administered by the Bureau of Indian Affairs to conduct burns with the US Forest Services for reducing fuel on ancestral landscapes used in the past for ceremonies, hunting, and gathering. This initiative, part of the Greater Santa Fe Fireshed Coalition, has been credited with preventing the 2020 Medio fire and protecting the watershed of the city of Santa Fe and surrounding areas. While these practices and partnerships have demonstrated their successes, both in terms of cultural restitution and in protecting Santa Fe neighborhoods and assets, the prevailing perception that fire is inherently negative remains still a significant challenge to their widespread adoption. In 2018, I have launched a partnership, Canary in the Mine, after the mega fires of 2017 in Portugal, where I'm originally from, aimed at re-examining the role of fires in the Mediterranean landscapes and its importance for local communities. This was rooted in a partnership we established here at the GSD and with the local governments. This initiative generated a series of discussions with the local communities, imagining the future of this territory in which fire suppression, rural dispossession, and land use changes with economic changes as well, have resulted in a fuel accumulation over decades. In these discussions, there was identified a project moving forward with the community based on a network of existing terraces and dry stone walls. So not only these landscapes have a cultural, a tectonic, and ecological relevance, but they're also part of the identity of these villages integrated in agricultural practices. Adding to this, they also hold significant microclimatic protections and affordances due to its capacity in storing humidity and reducing the temperatures around this village. Therefore, a potential fire break infrastructure with ecological value. So the development of this project entailed the documentation of these dry walls and these building techniques, the understanding of the sectional landscape components and their reciprocities. For instance, the contiguities to water channels and streams, the nutrient cycle recharge from the ashes of small fires, and the manure produced by goats and sheep grazing on the higher terrains and carried by gravity. These studies were also developed with the community and further integrated with emerging programs at the national government level, seeking for wildfire protection alternative approaches. In consequence of this initiative, terrace and walls have been reconstructed for reasserting the local economy and labor, also giving an opportunity to reinforce the tectonic legacy, local labor, and associated techniques. This initiative and shared stewardships helped consolidate and revitalize the productive buffer of around 100 meters around this rural village, while re-operationalize it into a new fire landscape infrastructure to enhance resiliency against escalating wildfire threats. The second part of this program supports pastoral practices in the upperlands and the community grounds to boost soil organic content and reduce fuel loads. This implies also one, cold fire, or meaning in this context a pastoral fire, from January to February, renew the pastures with new growth of grasses containing high levels of protein to feed the pregnant female goats and sheep. The last evidence of progress I want to share with you is in West Africa, Guinea-Bissau, focused on the work of the NGO CAFO in the initiative of community forests with local modes of governance. Characterized by a mosaic of savannas, open woodlands, forests, rice fields, and mangroves, Guinea-Bissau confronts a diverse array of challenges, including food security in the rural areas. The government holds ownership of the rural lands and their natural assets, regulating access with top-down regulation on fire suppression. Despite such regulation, Guinea-Bissau, like many other African countries, is a fire region, often transforming the landscape in a time-based agroecological and religious practice with still unrecognized wildfire mitigation effects. The interaction with fire occurs in many different activities throughout the year and closely tied with the wet and dry seasons, productive cycles, and then occurring in the different places of their villages and surrounding landscapes in preparation, for instance, of the fields for planting beans, wheat, and sorghum, or producing charcoal, an activity mostly made by women to secure some financial autonomy. Importantly, for the maintenance and fertilizing and recharging lalas. Lalas are areas of low fertility soil for supporting the growth of grasses and creating habitat buffers between the grasses and the forest for production, for instance, of honey. Additionally, for keeping the woodlands open and accessible for harvesting different products. In recognition of this essential reciprocities, ecological and social, the NGO CAFO, in collaboration with the Institute of Biodiversity and Protection Areas, has initiated a land stewardship program of community forests in the Oyo region. So you see here 1, 2, 3, 4, and 1, 2, 3, and 4 are the community forests locally designated, to be maintained and managed through an organized community in the core of the villages. One example up and running is in the community forest of Canquebo. This land empowerment initiative has allowed the community to manage their natural resources and products, including generating profits from selling locally in the markets. And with the profits, the community was able to construct a mosque, a school, to buy a small bus to bringing products to the local markets and allowing the travels to the hospital, and also buying a rice sheller so women have extra time for other activities. Despite the successes of this initiative, with social, cultural, and environment implications, the government has not yet formalized this land tenure and jurisdiction, a process that CAFU is working hard to ensure its recognition and safeguarding, as climate degradation is already shortening the length of the rainy seasons. So going back to the early question, where is now the fire in the clearing, and why does it matter today? The use of cold fire, rooted in bottom-up initiatives and local knowledge for maintaining the clearing, or mosaics, as our colleague Richard Foreman names it, is an ancient practice. The clearings, fire, ashes, and associated habitat buffers holding diverse vegetation types, successional ages, and species composition not only enhance biodiversity, but also embody a long overdue recognition and restitution of productive stewardships. Importantly, they make a meaningful and necessary contribution to wildfire reduction. So, to summarize, they are good fires, the ones that we want to bring back to the landscape, and the bad fires, the ones that we want to avoid. Shared stewardships with the empowerment of fire knowledge among traditional native communities and First Nation peoples support a paradigm shift by recognizing the ecocultural significance of cold fire and related substances in fostering ecosystem health and cultural restitution. Lastly, I want to thank the communities of Arganil, Benfeita, Cepos, Relva Velha, Pardieiros, Barroselos, Enxudre, Namanaco, Bironqui, and Indamicunda, and also Erika Castanheira and Sambusek for their stewardship and continuous inspiration. Thank you. Do you need a pen?
No. Okay. I was imagining us with 8 inches of snow outside when I made this first slide, but no. Before I get started, I also would just like to acknowledge that all of the work that I will present is work that I did while I was at STAS. So just acknowledging the many people who worked on that through the office. Boston's legacy of landscape architecture and regional open space planning can be read in its canopy. The parks and parkways of Charles Eliot and Sylvester Baxter's Metro Park system, alongside Olmsted's Emerald Necklace, represent visionary action and activism in practice, and together create a system of protected parks and parkways dense with tree canopy that surround and thread through the city. These park systems, alongside more recently protected lands, have done much for the ongoing health of our urban canopy and the experience of a healthy urban forest for many of Boston's neighborhoods. Adjacent residents and visitors alike enjoy lush pedestrian pathways through the necklace and the urban wilds. However, there's another story in Boston's urban forest history, one of removal and loss. Neighborhoods throughout Boston have seen infrastructure arise where forest once was. In East Boston, the much-loved Neptune Road neighborhood, once filled with lush tree-lined streets, today sits next to chain-link fences and walls separating them from train lines and the Logan Airport runway, while planes fly in just overhead. In other areas, urban renewal projects demolished entire neighborhoods, leaving little to no canopy. Highways separated neighbors and created challenging conditions for healthy canopy growth. And these conditions are not just historical. In 2020, protesters along Columbia Road were actively working to prevent the removal of the much-beloved mature trees in a neighborhood of generally high social vulnerability and low canopy. In 2021, with this history as context, the city began the urban forest plan process, the first official plan of its kind in Boston. And this history defined the plan's process and its overarching goals from the outset. The urban forest plan that emerged is a 20-year strategic plan that is based on science and defined by the needs and the desires of the Boston community. The plan assesses the state of Boston's urban forest today, and it makes recommendations for how Boston can collectively improve how trees are cared for and ensure that the urban forest will be better managed and available to the entire community, both today and into the future. Importantly, it recognizes that trees are critical infrastructure, not only for their measurable environmental benefits that we've heard about today, but also, as Ned so eloquently stated last night, that they play a key role in our systems of care for public health and wellness. There we go. The planning process recognized that access to the urban forest and its canopies benefits are not equitably distributed, and that this lack of equity reflects historic and ongoing physical, political, and social barriers. As well, that to successfully implement the urban forest plan, the community and city leadership must work together to eliminate these barriers and change practices that perpetuate them. This process involved discovery or understanding what the state of the forest is today, and a process of relationship building. Relationship building began with the creation of a community advisory board to help guide the project. And while many projects have community advisory boards, the structure of this was different than most, in that at the center of it was something that we called the Equity Council. This group was comprised of leaders in the communities with the lowest canopy, the highest social vulnerability, and historically the least access to city leadership and the kinds of conversations we were having. Their voice was at the center of the advisory process. We also chose to run the advisory board as a single group that included community members, industry experts, nonprofit partners, and city staff together instead of speaking independently to us at different times. In part with the recognition that city staff are also residents of the city and so therefore have dual roles to play. Also in a recognition that there is an historic lack of trust due to these conversations happening behind closed doors and not a mutual understanding of the concerns and issues. So together, this board explored the issues and the challenges facing Boston's urban forest today and set a series of goals and action steps to achieve those. These conversations were informed then by data that was collected on the ground through a survey of the nearly 40,000 street trees in Boston, in addition to existing data. And I'll just note that this is important, as we heard from David Nowak earlier, that just collecting this data and understanding what is out there is needed in many cities and was deeply lacking in Boston, and continues to need, more data has continued to be needed. What we found is that Boston's overall canopy coverage is a little low, but generally comparable to cities of similar size and climate, comes in at 27%. However, the canopy is distributed very unevenly, with neighborhoods levels ranging from below 10%, as we see in East Boston, Charlestown, South Boston, and Central Boston, which includes Chinatown, while others come in at around 44%, such as Jamaica Plain and West Roxbury. And in light of the evidence that David Nowak shared with us earlier of the significant health and economic benefits of even a difference of 10% in canopy, this difference that we see here is made quite stark, right? We understand that the significantly higher deaths related to heat, for example, happen under that. So This canopy distribution very clearly displays a north to south pattern. And this distribution is not surprising in light of the historic parks and parkways that I mentioned, as well as the numerous social marginalization and discrimination practices that have shaped Boston. The canopy distribution is also not equitable. The neighborhoods with lower canopy generally have higher concentrations of socially vulnerable populations. These are defined by a set of parameters in the city's climate-ready studies and by state-defined environmental justice categories. Social vulnerability here includes low to no income communities, communities of color, and communities with limited English language, for example. Not surprisingly, these areas of low canopy and high social vulnerability overlap significantly with areas previously redlined by the Homeowners Loan Corporation. The redlining process, as most of you probably know, was explicitly racist. These neighborhoods were deemed hazardous, leading to the denial of residents access to capital investment that generally would have improved the housing economic opportunity and long-term investment in and stability of the area. So here we see neighborhoods that were given C and D ratings or yellow and redlined overlapped with canopy, and the numbers down below seeing that a Class D or redline neighborhood today now has about 17.9% canopy, while a Class A is about 54.1% canopy. So pretty significant differences. Overcoming these differences in canopy distribution requires collaboration between departments within the city, and most importantly, between the city and the residents, in part because over 60% of Boston's canopy is on private land. So the city alone cannot do this. So at the outset of the planning process, the city's tree care was deeply underfunded. Gary mentioned this earlier. What we found was a community of caretakers, both inside and outside the city, who were deeply invested in improving the canopy, but who each in their own way were struggling to adequately care for and increase the canopy, due in large part to the lack of financial and staffing capacity for the city's incredible tree warden, Max Ford Diamond on the left. For some reason, everyone in forestry is named Max. It's a fascinating thing. It was, he was doing incredible work, but really having a hard time moving beyond reactive care just due to the nature of the limited funding within the city. And then that kind of trickled down to challenges for the community groups to then partner with the city that's already straddle or dealing with so much work they kind of can't get out from underneath it. So the plan, what emerged then was the identification of goals that guide this plan, and these happened really through multiple discussions with the advisory board, and following the guiding principle of equity really were determined by the Equity Council. And then a set of strategies that follow these. What these goals I won't go into these too much, but they're essentially equity first, a proactive care and preservation, that the outcomes that are led by the needs and interests of the community, and that the fourth goal was really about creating a culture that prioritizes and values trees as a community asset that supports the entire community. I think we need to put Ned in charge of that one. And it's important to note that at no point in the process did a tree canopy percentage target emerge as a determinant for success. And this was a much discussed decision, and the reason for avoiding a number was equity-based. Neighborhoods that have the support, financial capacity, and access to the city tend to be upper middle class, while lower income and historically marginalized communities commonly don't have these same resources. So this can lead to the neighborhoods with higher canopy continuing to increase, leading to an overall city number that is higher, but the neighborhoods that have low canopy not increasing at the same rate. So while measuring the success on these four goals may be a little bit more tricky, the goal or the hope is that it does lead to a better outcome for the city. We then have 7 strategies that support these, and these focus on leadership, proactive tree care, creating space for trees, improving communication, and building a local tree workforce. And the strategies themselves are given more detail through 30 recommendations, 86 actions, and a number of these are kind of then defined as early or critical, meaning early being things we can do right now, and critical meaning they have to be done in order for the rest of the goals and strategies to take place. In the interest of time, and so that you can enjoy the first read of the 150 pages plus of the plan, I will not run through each of those. I want to flip instead to implementation and close with a couple priorities here. Implementation begins with the critical and early actions. The first was the formation of a new position for a director of urban forestry, which is a critical leadership position that can guide the city's efforts moving forward. This position was funded early in the planning process and filled shortly after completing the plan, in part because Mayor Wu came on about halfway through, and as you may have seen yesterday, she's a big advocate, and so that really started to move the plan as it was being made. Acting swiftly on this has meant that the city's been able to get started on several other critical and early actions, in particular to engage in community dialogues and relationship building. And this was, there we go. This was a kind of the relationship building part of this, and what's important about that is that laying the groundwork for action was really about building consensus on existing conditions and what's needed to cohesively make change through specific neighborhood level, community-led planning and design to come. So what we did was lay out priority zones that then direct the chief urban forester's work. Those are defined by 4 factors: environmental justice consensus blocks, low canopy, high heat hours, and historic marginalization. In this case, specifically redlined and yellow-lined. So any area with 3 or more overlapping factors should be prioritized. Within the year after the launch of the Urban Forest Plan, which is taking place here at the Arnold Arboretum, which graciously donated 10 Dawn Redwoods to the process, the city has acted on a number of the critical actions and been able to use the plan to gain financial support from external sources. Importantly, they've made a commitment to funding efforts to expand through $11.4 million via the Inflation Reduction Act. And this is leading to a number of important items. One, hiring new staff arborists and administrative positions, as well as field labor staff, setting up direct contact between residents and the city, things that seemed obvious but didn't exist before, proactive care measures, such as more frequent pruning cycles, and then perhaps most importantly, 2 items. One is the creation of the Boston Tree Alliance, a cooperative alliance of nonprofits that's administered by Mass Audubon, with the primary aim of getting trees planted on private property in environmental justice areas. And lastly, at the launch of the Forest Plan, the city announced the creation of the Power Corps program, which is a workforce development program based in Upham's Corner and geared towards providing young individuals with the opportunity to gain tree care skills that lead to opportunities for employment within Boston. Continued funding for this expansion was also included in the grant. I think, in closing, I think a couple kind of just maybe provocations. It's worth noting here a prior question regarding labor and class. And while I think the Power Corps program is great and a critical part of the plan, it doesn't overcome the fact that the city has been posting jobs for some time, and these jobs have not been filled in part due to the low wages that are offered, and the requirement that individuals who work in the city live in the city. So conversations were had around relieving this requirement for urban forestry workers, but perhaps the better conversation would be about how to raise these wages and or to make the city more affordable for those doing this kind of work and other critical jobs. So the Forest Plan and these ongoing actions are an important step in Boston's overall efforts to mitigate and adapt to risks associated with the climate crisis. Simultaneous to this plan, the city was undergoing a heat resilience plan and finalizing its series of coastal adaptation plans, all that aim to kind of reduce risks and acknowledge a deep disparity in social inequity that have shaped Boston. I think these changes often challenge existing structures and rarely roll out fluidly, as we know. So to achieve an equitable urban forest will require ongoing attention and collaboration. Actions taken thus far have been important and reflect a commitment to change, and they're generally low-hanging fruit. Trees are in competition for space with affordable housing, with transportation, and other critical social infrastructure. Making space for trees in dense historic neighborhoods and prioritizing tree preservation and new canopy planting alongside new development that supports much needed affordable housing in growing neighborhoods will be challenging and require communication, trust, and tough conversations. This plan seeks to place trees in that conversation with higher priority and the kind of love for them that Ned inspired us all to last night. Thank you.
We're going to have a fun conversation in a few minutes. I want to carry on the conversation of stewardship through the lens of shared responsibility and how we engage large communities in action. I do want to start by recognizing the incredible group of people that worked on this project in Cambridge. The city of Cambridge is an unusual place with an incredibly visionary and dedicated staff and leadership who's willing to spend money on the kind of work that we did. We also had a task force of residents, representatives from the institutions, business owners, a high school student who met with us every month for more than a year to guide our work. And we had an incredible team of consultants led by Reed Hildebrand, and I want to recognize Stephanie Shaw, who's here, who worked on this, Matt Soul, and of course Gary, who was critical to the process and led us and actually agreed to do a project we had no idea how to do. For context, here we are, our fair city. Most of you know it well. If you don't, we are at the basic geographic center right now in Gund Hall. In 2018, when we began this project, there was 26% canopy cover, and as Amy suggested, this is a dodgy thing to study too much. But the context of this, which is important, is that just 10 years before, there was 30% canopy cover in the city of Cambridge. And people had recognized this, and it had caused the citizens to come and ask the city to undertake this project. We projected forward. One of the first things we did was ask, if we don't do anything, what happens? Recognizing the climate change, the pressures on the urban forest, where will we be? Or here's the canopy cover loss in 2018. So where will we be? Projected loss by 2030, 18%. Projected loss by 2050. If we don't do anything, the city is at 10%. The difference between a city at 26% or 30% and a city at 10% is an incredibly different place to live and work and exist. So that was the context where we were starting our project. And people quickly took notice. Early in the process, one of the great broadsheets in Cambridge, tree canopy collapsing. Nothing like a good headline. But dig a little deeper and we're searching for the villain, and the villain is development. Look at that, cash, greed. And if you look on the right, trees scheduled to be cut down, development, development, development. Sometimes the city's at fault too, sometimes the utilities are at fault. But the villain here is really development and density. And protests happened when Harvard took a tree down at the Divinity School. There were protests. It was covered in the Globe and the Crimson. And there began to be, rallies for the trees. Particularly, I love this tagline, saving our trees is everyone's job. And I want to come back to that because that's this question of whose responsibility is it? We early on in the process did a survey, and surveys are also notoriously not very representative because only, these are the people deciding to answer these. We asked people where should trees be planted. Interesting, 26% said private properties, but many more people said it was the cities, the developers, and the institutions' job to plant trees. We asked about regulation. Should the city have laws to protect large trees? Yes, they should on public property, 93%, but only 58% on private property. And that was the context for developing this plan. And we had 3 pillars: equity, resiliency, and shared responsibility. I want to focus on shared responsibility, but quickly through the lens of equity. This is going to be a little bit of a repeat from what Amy showed you, but the forest in Cambridge is not equitable either. Yes, we have 26% canopy cover, but half the city to the west is above that average. And the other half to the east is below that. This is a stark change. When you actually look at this in relation to the history of redlining, look at the pattern of the highest grade, best, all the way down to the redlined communities. And look at what the canopy cover looks like today. Again, it is an almost, exact pattern of that. And when we look at where the Cambridge's vulnerable communities lie, this is where they live as well. And they're the least able to adapt to a changing climate. And if we look at where the red in the heat island effect is, it's those communities as well. But interestingly, when we look at responsibility, it isn't shared either. And this is where the data is really interesting. When we look at the trees in the city, 42% of the canopy is public trees, but 58% of the canopy is on private property. So we do have a shared responsibility. But interestingly, if we look at that canopy cover loss in the 10 years before our project, and we ask where most of it was, 72% of it was on private property, residential zoned property. If we're looking for the villain, it's us. This is the tyranny of small choices. This is what's happening around us. So how do we empower action within that context? And I think it's important to think about municipal action and to think about citizen action. And in a way, this is a false choice because citizens are the city and the city is the citizens. But let's think about it at scale and think about where these responsibilities happen. We do need to think about trees as urban infrastructure. In the 19th century, we rebuilt our cities to bring fresh water and take sewage away. These were heroic acts. These were in response to epidemics in the city, and today heat is the epidemic of our city. It's the public health crisis. So the city has to act. And there are places where the city really does need to act and individuals can't. And the scale is the question. So one of the places we think municipal action has to take place is in creating cool corridors. We talked about connectivity a little bit this morning, but how do we think about looking at the canopy of the city as connective tissue that connects those underserved communities to cooling centers, to parks and areas and cultural centers, to commercial districts? The people who are on those streets are using public transportation, walking. They are the underserved communities. So can we build a series of cool corridors by planting 12,000 street trees? And yes, that has measurable impact on cooling in specific locations in the city. There are also significant areas of the city where, again, it takes the city to act, because there are places where density of our urban environment makes it very hard to plant on private property. If we look at West Cambridge and East Cambridge again, and we look at this question of whose trees are they, there's lots of private trees in West Cambridge where people have big backyards or nice front yards like this. But in East Cambridge, there's not a lot of space to plant trees. So how do we deal with that? We have to look at the plantable area in these districts, and when you look at plantable area, you see how little there is in East Cambridge. And what is plantable? Well, in this map, we didn't count the streets as plantable. But what if we did? So yes, the city has to actually reframe the way we think about our streets. These are the streets we have today, and we modeled a series of ways of thinking about creatively redesigning our streets so that they have space for trees. And the only people that can act here is the city at this scale. And the citizen action, this is the other question. How does the citizenry act, or how do we help them act? And I want to go back to the infrastructure. So if you put all those pipes in the street, you've also got to replumb your house. So we have a responsibility to rethink how we think about our properties. Often regulation and policy are thought of as like, the stick and the punishment. We have plumbing codes too, and we follow them. We don't think of them as punishment. So we thought a lot about the question of policy. How do we encourage collective action? And in many cities, there are tree protection ordinances, and this was a big one in the city of Cambridge. We looked at actually how to enhance it. When we started this project, it did not apply to property, to residential property, only to large-scale developments. When we talked about expanding its purview, there was a lot of backlash. A lot of people said, don't tell me what to do on my property. This is mine, and I get to think about it. But we wanted to expand that thought and think about how your property is part of a city, and you have a responsibility to a much larger community. We also did another thing, which was to think about the question of disturbance, which I loved from this morning's conversation, which is trees come down. It's a kind of disturbance. So how can we rebrand this less punitively and tragically and think about it more regeneratively? If you take a tree down, plant a new one. If you don't have room to plant a new one, contribute to a fund, and the city will plant a new one in another neighborhood. This was really actually as much about language and branding as it was about policy. The other place to think about policy is zoning. I know zoning is not that sexy, but it's really powerful. If you look at the 10 years before our project, the number of properties that went through large project review, this is 5% of the city. This is not every project that had zoning relief. If you added every project that had zoning relief, you'd probably have twice as many. If you start to shape these properties through zoning, you transform the way the city looks. We worked with a resilient zoning task force to develop a score sheet. It's a little bit like LEED. It's a little bit like doing your taxes. But how can you think about when you build on your property, doing things that cool the environment? And this was data-driven, and it was focused on cooling. We now call it the green factor because apparently that has better branding value. The highest value in this system, saving large canopy trees. Second, planting new ones. And you get extra credit if you put it within 20 feet of the right-of-way because you are doing work to cool your community, not just your own home. And then last, this question of agency and helping larger groups of populations take action. So you have to give knowledge and tools. Here we undertook a project of activation. This was after the first part of the project, and it was an engagement was organized about how do we help people do the work that we think the Forest Master Plan requires. Through a series of focus groups, and this was led with communications consultants, we asked people, talked a lot about data this morning, all this question of how you value the forest and its ecosystem services or its dollars, apparently that doesn't actually resonate that well. I think Ned's idea resonates better. Quality of life, environment, equity. It's the more soft feeling questions of what a forest does that resonated with people. We also thought about targeted messaging. So if you want to get a resident homeowner to plant a tree, that's a very different conversation than if you want a renter, and there's lots of those in Cambridge, to care for a street tree. And so this developed a very targeted set of messages, which gave the city design guidelines and messaging toolkit so that they could communicate with their citizenry through things like social media to begin to activate people. We also developed a program called Forest Friends, which is a kind of shared tree care program and a volunteer tree care guide. Again, all focused around these narratives. If you walk around the city today, you'll see these tags asking people to join these programs. And actually, it's been a really successful program. I do want to recognize that there are a couple of things that hopefully we can talk about that I think are really unresolved, and they're hard. One, in those communities where there aren't resources, people don't have the money to plant trees. The city can't go planting trees in people's backyards for legal reasons. How do we build systems where we can help people plant trees? Secondly, there is fear. Trees cost money. They rip up your sidewalks. They get into your sewer system. You have to maintain them. How do we help those communities pay for or have insurance programs to help them manage the costs of trees in their neighborhoods? We're going to talk about how to get those answers great. Okay. So what can we achieve if we do all of these things? Well, it's pretty exciting, I think. If you think about public-private partnerships and everybody taking action in their part of the city, there are real impacts. We looked at the 2018 canopy. We tried to build a kind of optimized but realistic vision of what the city could look like if we planted all those trees. And here's the cooling impact. It's actual real change. And when we look at the kind of mortality questions on heat, this can have a real impact on the life of our city. And I just want to close by saying, if you look around the city, you will see a lot of new trees being planted. It is exciting to see. This is our city forester. Last year, they planted 1,100 bare root trees throughout the city from 100 or 200 in years past, and there are 1,250 trees planned for 2024. This is a total change in scale. The city has stepped up to do its part in transforming, really, the urban forest in Cambridge for the future. And I guess the question I will just leave is, where can the rest of us take our part of the bargain here, step up to the plate, and do our part to rebuild the urban forest? Thanks.
All right, well, thank you all so much for those inspiring presentations. Somehow, even without us really talking beforehand, we all kind of all converged, I think, in our thoughts. So that's exciting to begin the dialogue that way. I think that what was inspiring about it was that you all shared with us sort of the future potential that's perhaps rooted in Indigenous knowledge and beliefs, and the possibility of people perhaps living once again in harmony with nature rather than destroying it, unfortunately, as we have been. And perhaps a forest future that's more than just imagined, but actually realized. And so I think in general, this symposium has been inspirational for me, being a farm girl from the Midwest that grew up hanging on trees, my hands dirty, a background in plant science, so I align with all the plant nerds in the room, and of course the designers and landscape architects. But I did want to come back to, there was a moment where I was looking at the brochure up there, and I sat for a while, and I didn't understand why I couldn't respond to the question, will the forest save us all? And it took me some time and days, and it's been up in the lobby. And I realized this morning, as some of you might do in the morning after your shower, whatever, there's a moment that just pops into your head. And I realized I had this visceral memory come back to me, and it was from a couple months ago when I was at the COP conference in Dubai, and I was sitting in a small discussion group, and there was a Peruvian tribal member, an older gentleman, who was sitting in front of me in tears and said, "I'm sorry, I'm having a really hard time being here right now and talking with you all because our tribal leader was just murdered this past weekend for defending their forest." And it's those kind of moments that make you, I think, really rethink this whole conversation, the situation that we're in, why we're talking about forest and talking about the state of the world. And I think for me, it's why this statement or question was difficult, because I don't know that I believe the forest should save us. And I'm wondering if that question should be expanded to, will humans change to protect and restore the forest to save us all? And I really think that that's where your presentations were coming from too, is that this question around equity and colonization and where we are. And so I wanted to start the conversation there with from all of your rich experiences that you've been through. Do you see that hope through your work, that deep sense of human change, that desire and willingness to change our perspective and our future? And if you have some experiences that you would like to share with us, I think that would be wonderful, because I think the big question is about how we bridge this equity gap in the forest futures.
I'm happy to start, since I'm if you follow that.
That's why we made sure you're sitting there.
I like very much the conversation earlier this morning, because it puts the forest also as an artifact rooted in cultural practices. And cultures are different. We are different. And I think it's really important when we talk about forest, who is talking about forest? What is the agency to this forest? Because I'm coming from a country that forests doesn't dominate, but still, we don't call them forests, we call them orchards, we call them open woodlands. So there's also a variety of descriptions that unpack this concept of forest. So being integrative and inclusive and hearing who is talking about forest and what does forest means to them as a collective is important. I got further more interesting on this question because the work, this interaction and collaborative work I do in Guinea-Bissau also allowed me to understand that for them, forest is food, is not timber. So, and that changes the whole perception of what forest or open woodland means, because it's not just the forest as a thing, it's the forest interacting with other landscapes around that are constructed and maintained by the local communities.
Yeah. I really appreciate the question and the thinking, because I think I'm similarly struck by it, and this feeling of, I don't think that's the forest's job. Is that putting too much, onto the forest? But rather the way I think about it is, especially in reflection with thinking about the urban forest and equity, issues of social equity, is that it comes down to relationships. And that I think through many of the conversations this morning, the underlying piece there and the way that history has been combined with science really is reflecting a loss of relationship. And I think that is with regard to our relationship to trees and the forest, the tree as the individual organism and the forest as the system, but also our relationships to one another. And, both need mending, in the way that we exist now. And so I think that is our work. And in relating, I do think that greater relationships to forests, and very much in the context of what Silvia is mentioning, of forest means so many things to so many different people. And that we need to, then when I say we, it's like individual people within their own context. What is that relationship? What are communities' relationships to the landscapes that they exist in? I think that's the work, and that is something that we engage, the forest must be engaged in, but that we have to do. And I mean, of course, with Michael's, we also have those kinds of relationships in the forest, the Tinder types that we have to consider.
I think I'll just add that although I showed you a lot of maps and data, we did start our approach to this project very much about the human quality of being amongst trees, and the belief that to have a functioning city and a civil society, you need to have space that people can interact and gather and be together. And honestly, I think feel that the trees are required for that in a place like Cambridge. I'll also just reiterate, I think the other thing in our focus groups, this question of what trees mean to different communities was absolutely pervasive in those conversations. And so maybe talking about targeting sounds a little too, like we're trying to sell some product to people. But that changing the narrative and the way you talk to the communities about what you think is of value to everyone is one of the take-homes of that process. And it's hard work for a city of this size to do. The city of Cambridge has engaged a series of basically local ambassadors they're working at a larger scale in terms of environment to be the communicators between the city and the local different neighborhoods. And I think that's a very powerful tool in terms of how to kind of bridge those gaps.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to kind of bring us back around to it, that, how do we reprioritize, right? How do we start seeing trees as part of critical infrastructure, right? It's that reframing, it's how do we how do we reposition that relationship with ourselves and with nature. And I mean, I do think that the work that you all have done is so incredible, and you are already making such great strides. I think going back to Eric, kind of where you were leaving your presentation, I think we've all kind of shifted from just speculating into we're on this cusp of acting right now. And so it would be wonderful just to hear a little bit from you all more about, obviously you spelled out some kind of barriers and obstacles that you're facing, but maybe advice to the many designers or the students in the room is, now that you've kind of had those experiences, how do you see us going forward? What support do you need? What other actors do you need in the room, or how do you see us kind of tackling them together?
Well, I'll just say I do want to advocate for political action. Cities need to situate their priorities through policy. And the only way they will do that is if we ask them to do it, because we vote, hopefully. And again, I really think policy has a bad rap as being negative, and it doesn't have to be. It should be articulating the values of the community. And again, it can be very flexible. These zoning policies and strategies can give lots of autonomy to people, but they guide change. And most communities do not have the capacity. Also, these policies happen at the local level, most of them, which is incredibly complicated because, what do we say, 350 whatever communities in Massachusetts alone. I would love for a group to take on building a policy guidelines for communities so that they can implement these processes for themselves, because most communities can't do that by themselves.
And I think what's interesting is oftentimes we see ourselves as designers in the design silo. And I think sometimes we don't realize, we don't feel maybe the agency to also jump into the policy silo. But there really are a lot of opportunities, I think, for us as designers that we can bring that kind of knowledge and expertise to helping advance that policy conversation. Sometimes policymakers actually want to make the policy changes, but maybe they don't have the data or the backing or maybe the graphics or something. So I think it's maybe just encouraging all of us to even get out of our comfort zone sometimes to help enable those changes, perhaps.
I love this conversation because when I started this work with these rural communities, I'm coming from a rural land, but I would never imagine that I would work in these rural territories because I was always working in urban projects. So when I started to work with these communities, in them, what can I do as a designer? As a designer, it even sounds arrogant to talk a designer. But anyway, what I realized is that we have amazing skills. And here at the GSD, we are trained to think with our hands and with our hearts, hopefully. But this helps us to communicate. We do amazing drawings, and the drawing is a language. And with these drawings, we can actually bridge science with politicians. We can communicate values, and I think that's where we are super, excuse me, perhaps it sounds arrogant, perhaps we are a little bit valuable in this, in this context. We help the communities. If we hear them, really hear them, we can help transform these desires into a drawings that everybody understands. That's where I felt like we actually could be valuable. And then the second part is I found many times that we are mediators in a way, because we listen, we communicate, and we transform desires into potential drawings that can become in the future choreographies. And I liked very much your presentations, because to do a project is also a fiction. Yeah, it's a fiction. But what we can create, and that's particular to landscape architecture, is that we develop choreographies. And it's like music. You create your choreography, your script, operating in time and space. And here, that's where we can come as a valuable discipline in these territories, in these complex challenges and multi-agents.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think if we look out at many of the most ambitious projects that we as designers we admire, or that have had significant influence on the shaping of cities or regions, most of those have come out of activism or activist practices. People who either within their role inside of a practice took on a vision or an idea and kept pushing it. They pushed it politically, they pushed it within the community, and got it to the point where it could become a project. And that's hard to do. I mean, I'm saying that as though, on the one hand, I think, yes, we all need to, especially in light of so many of the climate concerns and the social issues that we're dealing with, we need to imagine how we can have more activist practices. But how do we also do that? It's very challenging, and I'm sure you can speak to this, when you're also, earning a living, having a business. How do we balance those things? But I don't think we can lose sight of that, because most of these kinds of projects, these projects very rarely happen out of an RFP. They take that kind of action and vision to happen. And then the other thing, maybe sidebar there too, well, perhaps it relates, is that, and Mayor Wu kind of hit on this last night, our politicians, our governance changes so rapidly. And it is difficult to move vision, like collective vision, forward when that's just shifting. When the politicians themselves are, I think, often kind of frustrated by the fact that I'm just getting started on something and now I'm like trying to get reelected, and I'm making compromises because I'm trying to get reelected. And well, on the one hand, I don't know what the solution to that is to figure that out, but without a kind of community level and outside of politics level of activism that continues to push whoever is in those offices, we're just perpetually in a cycle of kind of changing priorities and, things moving somewhere and then just dropping. And so that's, I think, just maybe highlighting part of a problem, and also this, continued significance of being engaged in that way.
I think we could keep going and going. This will probably continue through the evening, but I did want to open it up to the rest of the room for questions. We've got one in the back. Min, do you want to grab a microphone if anybody's got one?
Hi, thank you for the talk. One of the things I was curious about is in this talk and as well in the morning's talks, the idea that started to emerge is that we need to start to get comfortable with some removal of trees, or some destruction of trees, or loss of trees, and Ned also yesterday warned us against anthropomorphizing. Wow, that's a hard word. Sorry, trees, and sort of this idea of fretting over the loss of individual trees versus actually developing the future for a forest. And I'm wondering here if the sort of sentiment and narrative of tree hugging and nature loving and individual species loving, if that's actually getting in the way of the bigger project of developing forests.
That's a juicy one. I mean, of course, yes and no. In my mind, the removals of a number of large, old trees in the city of Cambridge was one of the things that galvanized people to demand that the city take on a project like that. So, in that way, there is power in that. But it's also clear, yes, that if people focus entirely on that, they are missing the larger point. And I think one of our goals was to, again, reshape the narrative that disturbance in any environment is part of the cycle. And there will be disturbance in the city of Cambridge. And as long as we are doing our job to replant and rebuild the forest, we'll be fine. One of the great graphs that we found through something that UVM did that we sort of borrowed was a diagram of canopy cover in Massachusetts. And it clearly shows that much of the canopy in the city of Cambridge was planted in one particular period in like the end of the 1800s and early 1900s, when there was a huge amount of building going on, lots of residents being built in Cambridge, and everybody would plant a tree in your front yard, a tree in your backyard. And those are the trees that are now dying. So a lot of them, from the early 20th century are 100 years old, and it's natural succession. But people don't see that, and they just see loss, and no one is replanting them. So as long as we engage in the cycle and we see the big picture, which is where history helps and all these things, yes, I think we'll be okay.
Yeah, I think that the issue kind of lies in that I don't think we being Western, predominantly white United States, I'll just frame that, we don't have a culture in which that love or that affection for the individual of the species has a context in which we can understand it as a process of change and a part of a system of growth, death, life, loss, in which that loss of that one in this moment is part of the growth of many in a time frame in which I, as an individual, may not get to appreciate it. I may not see that. So we have like a sentimentality around that individual that is where I'm not sure that it's like the environmentalist tree hugging that is the root of that. I think it's maybe has a little bit more about a kind of sentimentality of the things that I have, and the inability to see those things as those are not things I have. Those are things that I am in relationship to as I'm moving through this world and my own cycle of life and death. And I don't think we talk about that a lot. And if you look at a lot of other cultures that have tremendous love and respect for, say, a given animal that is also their food source, that there's a cycle there of death and acknowledgement, tremendous acknowledgement in that process, but also a taking and a use and appreciate different kind of relationship. So I think as someone who went to UC Santa Cruz and is like a a probably stamped, signed, sealed, delivered, tree-hugging hippie in my heart. I find it that's probably not the problem. I think it's galvanized a lot of change. But yes, that it does. There is a frame in which that gets lost because it's happening outside of a context of understanding ecological systems, relationships, and time in a way that is beyond ourselves. Thank you.
Yeah. Just to add a little bit to that, because I think it's a very interesting question. And I want to jump again into this idea. It's not about the cow, it's about the how. I don't know if you guys know about that. But it has to do with this discussion that, I was trying to be a vegetarian and then I stopped. It's related to the how, not the cow, because I realized that if I also don't eat the animals that are not producing ecological services on these landscapes that need to have less fuel, I'm also disrupting this system and also the economy. So I think we have always to think that also, even thinking about what our food is or what we eat, we are also impacting, we are making these landscapes, we are making these forests. Anyway, I don't know where I'm going to go, but this is to say that I think related with the concept of ecology is also the idea of entropy. That disturbances are part of the system, and sometimes we forget that. Sometimes to understand that in every process there's a moment of collapse, particularly in ecology, in landscapes, is happening. And we are not designing for risk anymore, we are designing for resiliency. And what does it mean, resiliency? Means that we have to be able to find alternatives for eventual disturbances, yeah? But as designers or as policymakers, we have to think about at a certain moment the system will fail, but we have then backup plan. So it's not about the cow, it's about the how.
Yeah, and I want to question again too, going back to the idea of disturbance too. Is it that we need to change our tree hugging? Is that the change that we need, or do we need to change? Or we need to let go of parking spaces so we can make room for the trees? So I think going back to if there is disruption, if there are things that we need to change and let go of, maybe we need to focus on what are those changes that we really need to accept. So my 2 cents. Okay, question back there.
I have 2 points. I promise they're brief. I haven't heard the word upcycle. You've been saying trees or no trees, either or. If for some reason, or if it falls over in a storm because the roots have been destroyed, have an old tree that's gorgeous, you can see inside. You can have the wood cut and made into unique tables. And I have a picture of one that I captured. I showed it to Michael. I sent it to a friend in Ghana. So it's not either or. And then that tree has to be replaced. But people who have that kind of tree in their living room or their dining room, this tree is amazing. It's got a growth pattern so that one of the chairs is between 2 parts of the tree. I mean, it's just gorgeous. I'll send it. The other thing is you
and
really
it's storing
have...
carbon too.
Pardon?
Which is good. And it's storing that carbon still too. So
yes,
as long as
absolutely.
it doesn't decompose.
And then the other thing is, I would say my basic viewpoint is chronic disease epidemiologist. So for those of us, I spent 10 years of my life in what used to be called the Elm City. And I actually married someone who was Dutch, my late husband. So the Dutch elm disease decimated the trees, the elm trees in Elm City. So we need much more surveillance of that kind of migration. Lyme disease started out in Connecticut, and there wasn't any in Maryland. When I grew up in New York and would take hikes in the forest with my dad, I didn't have to worry about ticks. I brought my young daughter on a hike, and we both got not elm disease, sorry. We got Lyme disease, and, she actually had, a neurological disorder, and my test didn't ever convert, but hers did. Between the two of us, we each had Lyme disease. So actually, I hadn't meant to go there, but we really need surveillance about pests. We really need real-time data showing where those are going, preventive measures, et cetera. I'm just making 2 points I think have been left out.
Definitely.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And we might have time for just one more question. Do we have one right here in the middle? Here, Jimmy.
I don't need a mic. I can project my voice. Oh, this is right. That's right. I guess my question is, as I was sitting here and thinking about the points that you all made and spoke to, and this idea that it seems to be a synthesis between these kind of economic, cultural, and educational priorities, where do we find that interjection point at this moment, 2024, where communities are now, and how do we meet folks at the table in a way that we're not continuing to spout information that, preaching to the choir in some senses, as we all know, but also thinking about ways where values of the community when it comes to policy and planning may not always align with the progressivism that we need to push these ideas forward, or the value of trees economically may say, oh, well, let's plant some beautiful trees here, but now everyone sees that as a value to the neighborhood, and gentrification increases. So where do we come to this injection point that makes sure that we can do all of this? And obviously this is a really difficult question, but make sure that we can do all of this in a way that we are still balancing the needs and the equity and the problems that are going on, but also not giving way to letting the forest collapse and die.
You see, I don't think we are preaching to the choir. I don't think this is a choir. Or it's a choir with too many different voices, right? And that's beautiful. Even things that I believe may not resonate with you. If I hear that we have to build trees, when I hear that, I just think, where is the water in my country to put water in those trees? It's not easy. So that's why I'm saying you're not preaching to the choir. I don't buy that argument so fast, because I know that I need water. So that's why I think even grasslands and meadows are a paradise in certain regions, that perhaps they don't need so much trees. Some of the native communities in California, they think the best forests are the ones that are very dappled, not packed, because they think of security. Right? Because more load, more trees, more understory, more canopy equals wildfire threats. So that's why even here, there's different conceptions of what a healthy forest is, because it's also, again, culturally rooted. Yeah?
Yeah, I'll say, without giving up on the forest, we should be focused on what the goal is. And I don't know that the goal is just the forest. The goal is the things that are happening in the forest. For Cambridge, it's really about cooling. And so there are lots of ways to get there, and we may have to change our image of what the city looks like, to maybe Pamela's point, and there are multiple ways to get there. So if you maybe focus on the end goal and not just the how or the kind of what it is, there's maybe, yeah, there you go. We might be able to get that.
Yeah, I think maybe just emphasizing or adding an emphasis to the point I think you're making is that when you start to have these conversations with the community, people don't want the same things. There's a lot of community members that don't want trees in their yard. And that's important to understand why. And in some cases, they're never going to want a tree in their yard. And in others, there are reasons that if the systems are in place to overcome that reason, then yes, they would love a tree, right? And so that really becomes about dialogue. But I think partly I'm hearing a couple of things in the question. One is, I think this was the case in Boston. It's really hard to have even that dialogue when there's a history of a lack of dialogue, or the perception that decisions are being made behind closed doors that don't consider the community, real or not. That perception leads to the immediate breakdown when you try to begin to have those conversations. And so I think, I often think of our kind of community advisory board as like, it was like a test, It was sort of, let's try to do this differently. It didn't always work. It was kind of messy. And partly, I think that's because what we actually needed before we did that was a year, maybe more, of conversations with the community that has been left out to get out a lot of the stuff that's going to get in the way. It's hard to ask people to kind of come to the table and talk about what's now when they're carrying, a lot of load of what has happened before, sometimes generational, and so I think that's a big, I'm not sure if it's directly what you're asking, but I feel like it's a big part of the kind of how do we move. We have to continue to have dialogue and conversation, not just at the moment when, we need to make a plan, and so now we're going to reach out to you. Because you don't get the answers to the actual questions you're asking when that happens a lot of the time. You wind up kind of having these sidebars because someone's got something that's been bothering them, and they are going to come to the meeting and tell you about that thing, and it may be a place where you don't have the opportunity to do anything about that. And that can sometimes then perpetuate the sense of, they're not listening, So I think somehow that kind of continued dialogue needs to happen. Yeah.
Thank you so much. You all have been wonderful.
Thank you.